We're going to talk today about moving beyond just DHIS2 apps. So we've heard a lot about extensions to DHIS2 in a lot of the sessions here today. Many of you build them yourselves, or your teams build them, or you use them to integrate with other systems to extend the functionality that's built into DHIS2. And what we're going to talk a little bit about is what the platform provides as an infrastructure for those extensions, those applications, what it provides today, what we're hoping that it will provide in the future, and how we can all work together as a community to share those innovations, to work on them together, build them together, share the ones that have already been built and use them rather than reinventing the wheel every single time. Because we see that a lot in this space and in many spaces, that innovation happens and then it sort of dies away, and then innovation happens again, and maybe a lot of it could have been reused. So we're going to talk about how we can work towards that together. So let's start with talking about what are DHIS2 applications. Probably all of you know that this is DHIS2. This is the dashboards application, and there are many different apps within DHIS2. So this is actually DHIS2 with an application within it, and we'll talk about this is a relatively new concept that happened in the last 3 or 4 years. To split out this concept into a shell, which is the common things that is all of DHIS2, and then the application, which has the more specific functionality for something else, for a specific use case. And we'll talk about what that means. So similar to the dashboards application, we have other applications that can take that place. And you'll note that the header bar and a lot of other things under the hood are the same between all of these different applications, and they should be. Oh, that was not what I meant to do. Yes. So now let's wind back, and I'll go through these slides quickly for those of you that were at the DHIS2 Academy, annual conference in June of this year. But we'll wind back to 2019 presentation I gave in the previous DHIS2 annual conference in 2019. This is the amount of code and application code that the DHIS2 core team maintains, right? So this is 34 different applications, several different libraries. Each of those has a lot of these pieces that before 2019 were all kind of replicated in every single one of those applications. So you had 30 different applications with separate copies of, not copies, but similar logic for how to do authentication, how to do server discovery, how to do the header bar, and a lot of that logic, plus many other things, similar UI components, those types of things. Plus, we maintained 4 supported versions of these applications. So each one of those 34 applications had 4 copies of the code base that had to be maintained. So you have 170 some odd code bases that the core team at DHIS2 was maintaining, which is a lot. And that has a lot of challenges in terms of the velocity with which we can address issues, the velocity with which we can introduce new features, and just the complexity of everything that we need to deal with. And it's not just the core team also. So similarly, third-party applications would have to have that same replication of logic amongst different copies of the application that support different versions of DHIS2. Every single third-party application has to do a lot of the same things that other third-party applications and the core apps are all doing as well. So the idea from this winding the clocks back to 2019 was to take all of those common components, pull them out from the applications themselves, make the applications simpler, easier to build, easier to maintain, and we'll get into how they can also address the duplication. The duplication. Duplication. I'm duplicated on the screen right now. This is great. I'm going to try not to press any buttons that I'm not supposed to. So the third-party applications and the core applications share a lot of the same componentry, so they shouldn't be duplicated across all of those places. And this isn't just a thing for developers. I think that's important to remember, is that as a user of DHIS2, you also, every single user of DHIS2 also navigates through these different applications. And if they have to learn a new way to interact with DHIS2 and the common components of it in every single application, then it becomes a much higher training burden. It becomes a much higher maintenance burden for implementers to understand what the different applications, how those change over time if they don't change in sync, those types of things. So we also implemented an application development ecosystem. This is a very, very simplified version of this. Ecosystem probably isn't the right word. Maybe pipeline would be a better word. That goes from a developer building an application locally, testing against multiple versions of DHIS2, injecting that application into the common shell, uploading that to the App Hub. At the time of 2019, it was called the App Store, but that was a problem with certain trademarks. Preemptive, we changed the name. Upload it to a place where it can be shared and used by different implementations around the world, and then installed into a production instance of DHIS2. So the core concept here is, across all of these different innovations and across all of the DHIS2 community, we build, maintain, share, and use these innovations, and trying to make it easier and more efficient in terms of cost, in terms of complexity, in terms of effort, to do all of these things, to build, maintain, share, and use these extensions or these applications. So what are some of the components of this platform? There's the REST API, which many of you are probably familiar with. That's a very core fundamental piece of it that's been around for quite a long time. And that is very extensive. It's sometimes difficult to understand all of the things that you can do with that API. It's everything in DHIS2, basically, because the core applications also use that API to perform all of the functionality that they support. It's the web application development framework, which I just kind of outlined, being able to have a common framework for a web application to share common functionality and similar development pipeline. Also the Android application SDK. So there is a library framework that's similar to the web app framework for Android applications for building native Android apps. That's used by the Android capture application from the DHIS2 core team, as well as many other third-party developers who are building applications on Android and using that common framework to synchronize a local copy of the database or a subset of the database of DHIS2 to the local device, to be able to query that, to be able to do operations offline. Those types of things are all provided as a common functionality. Lars mentioned the data store, which has been improved significantly in the recent releases. That is basically a database for applications to store data, to query data that doesn't fit into the native DHIS2 data model. We have user interface design systems and libraries, both for Android and for the web, to be able to provide a common interface and a consistent user experience to users of DHIS2 across all of these different applications. I mentioned yesterday the Java DHIS2 client, which is for interoperability. It's used in the CAML component to build integrations with third-party systems, standardized developer tools, including the ability to spin up local instances of DHIS2 in a very easy and fast way. And there's more down there that is off the screen that we won't talk about. I wanted to point out also the community of developers, which has been growing quite a bit since we started this in 2019. And this is the developer portal, developers.dhis2.org. It's a a place where we host our documentation, our guides. We have links to the community, both the community of practice as well as community specifically for developers in all of the different organizations that are building extensions to DHIS2. If you have developers in your organizations, I encourage you to have them join this community, because as much as they can learn from others in that community and from our developer advocate, who is a man named Renee, whose entire purpose is to build that community and build training material and build capacity in the developer community. Similarly, we can learn from your developers and from the developers that are out there that are building innovative extensions to DHIS2 every day, to learn how we can improve the functionality in the core of DHIS2 to support those extensions, and how the community can learn from each other and stop reinventing the wheel. So again, the goal is to make this cheaper and easier to build, maintain, share, and use these extensions. It's important to note that there's still work that needs to go into all of these things, and especially in the maintenance, it's something that is often underestimated, how much it actually takes to maintain an extension to anything, any type of software, but an extension to DHIS2 in particular over time, especially as you get more and more people to use that. There are costs involved, and there are challenges to the ongoing development of that software. So this is another functionality that was just added to DHIS2 in 239, so it should be coming out in the next week. And this is, seems like a very small thing, but it's something that kind of demonstrates the power of this common functionality or common framework for applications in DHIS2. And that is to be able to just see the application version that you're running. Right, so if we have the ability to install different versions of these applications, to upgrade them over time, as Lars mentioned, for the core applications, it's important if you're trying to identify where a problem happens to be able to see what version you're running. And instead of needing every application to build that into their code base because they're building an application from scratch, this can be just built into the platform and provided consistently to all applications, so that you can have one set of instructions for a user to say, if you need to report an issue with your application, please go to the menu, see the version, copy the debug information. It has a bunch of information that is useful for developers that maybe you wouldn't want to try to describe how to go and find for an end user. And that can be provided in a consistent way. So this is a small feature, but it's something that is becoming more and more important, especially as we're decoupling the core release from the application releases for core bundled applications, as well as for third-party applications. And I'll get into more about why this is useful for improving feedback and feedback loop mechanisms for third-party developers and developers of applications that are being shared as well. This is a little bit of a recap of what Lars mentioned this morning, talking about continuous delivery. So in the application management or the app management application, you can actually go and upgrade a version of the app that is bundled into DHIS2. So the app management app, this is a little bit matrix, but the app management app, or Inception probably, the app management app can be upgraded to a new version because there's a new version available on the App Hub that maybe isn't in 238 or whatever is running here. So this is very useful because as a new version becomes available, a new version of the capture application, of the dashboard application with new features, or even with a very small bug fix, this is something that can be upgraded independently of the WAR file of the core. And importantly, it can also be downgraded. So if you upgrade that application and you realize that there's an issue with it, or there's some doesn't work exactly for your use case, you can then downgrade back to the version that you were at before very, very easily with the click of a single button. So that's something that makes it much more agile in being able to deploy these applications. And I'll talk a little bit about how we're looking to improve this functionality as well. So you can see here how easy it is to install one of these applications. You just click the install button. It says app successfully installed, and now you have the app management app available here. And you can also see that the new versions are available. All the historical versions are available, so you can roll back to previous versions as well. This also integrates with the App Hub. So the App Hub is a place where all of those core applications are uploaded over time. New versions become available, as well as third-party applications that are shared and able to extend DHIS2 in a generic way. So you can search, you can install those applications, you can see when new versions are available, and you can access that directly through your DHIS2 instance, as well as through the App Hub itself at apps.dhis2.org. And I would be remiss not to also mention, I've talked a lot about web applications here, but there's also the Android SDK, which is a little bit of a different distribution mechanism, though there are ways that we're looking at improving that distribution mechanism to make it more like the App Hub. But the SDK allows, as I mentioned, a native Android application to be built and to use a lot of the core standard functionality in the DHIS2 Android capture application, like an offline data store that can be accessed. So now we'll talk a little bit about moving beyond just applications. So all of this is things that are available today in DHIS2. Many of you probably have used some of them, you've installed applications, but we'll talk about moving beyond that next. So another thing that is available today is plugins on the dashboard. Probably many of you know the core plugins, the data visualizer application, the maps application, and maybe you also know that you can build your own. So you can develop a custom dashboard plugin that you can then install and use on that dashboard. So in addition to improving the functionality of the dashboard plugins, we're also extending that capability to other places within DHIS, to other extension points. So Lars showed a screenshot of the capture application and the tracked entity dashboard, which shows information about a particular tracked entity. You saw some widgets on that screen. That will be another place where that can be extended. So you can develop and share custom widget types for a tracked entity. So it might be a widget for a graph showing the height over the last checkups of a child, for example, that might be specific to a particular program or specific use case, might be generic, but it's tied to some metadata. It might not be something that's out of the box within DHIS2. That's something that can be built and shared and used in different DHIS2 implementations. Similarly, data entry is another place where we're exploring opportunities for extension points. So right now we have custom forms, which have a lot of challenges in terms of maintainability, in terms of maintenance over time, and as well as adapting to different contexts. So for example, a custom form can't be used on an Android device if you're using the Android capture application. So looking at ways to build extension points that are generic and apply across the ecosystem into data entry, both for capture as well as for tracker data model, as well as for aggregate data model. Application modules in the Android app as well. So we heard a little bit earlier about the use case for LMIS in DHIS2 in the capture application, and using basically a program-specific screen for capturing data for a specific program in a customized way. And that's something we're looking into, how that can be made more generic and kind of installable or extendable within the DHIS2 implementation. Custom app layers is another one that we're exploring that can tie in with external services like Esri, like NASA, like Microsoft, like Google, similar to the way we have built-in support for the Google Earth Engine today, but being able to make that customizable and extendable for different service providers. In general, an extension is rarely just an app, either an Android app or a web app. It's often and I would say most of the time, it is much more than that. So it has some server component. It maybe has an application and a plugin. Maybe it has an integration with an external service. Maybe it has some reliance on some metadata configuration within DHIS2. There's system settings that need to be set, that need to be able to be configured to make the application work. It might have a custom data model in the data store in DHIS2. So it's very rarely just a web application or an Android application. So how do we, oh, I think this is maybe an older, oh, this will work. So this is a little bit technical, but we're not going to get into it. Diagram of kind of the components of DHIS2. So you have the DHIS2 core, which is what everybody knows is a WAR file you install on your server and it runs. But oftentimes there are a lot of other services that are involved in making this actually work. So you have the database, obviously. And Lars is shaking his head probably because he wants the database to be on the bottom and not on the top. He's very particular about where the database is. I'm going to keep it on the top. So this is a Postgres database. There's a Postgres database. There's also a gateway of some kind that will basically funnel some traffic to your DHIS2 instance. If you're running in a cluster, you might have multiple instances of DHIS2 here. And then you have the extension pieces. So it might be some custom scripts that are running on your server somewhere. You might have a custom backend component that provides an API to the applications that you've developed. You might have integrations in Camel or some other integration middleware to an external service. You might have 3 or 5 or 10 different external services that are all talking to each other. So it becomes part of a much bigger architecture than just the WAR file that's sitting on the server somewhere. So one way we're looking at making this easier to approach going forward is to make this more of a managed environment. So a lot of that kind of periphery around DHIS2 on the server becomes something that can be deployed as a single piece of software that can then be managed in a much easier way. It also can allow you to basically, as easy as it was to install a web application, you can install an application that also has a server-side component. So we heard from the CDC earlier about an R-Shiny application that does a lot of very interesting analytics on DHIS2, providing some data quality metrics. That should be something that everyone could point and click and install into their server and be able to run without needing to, as he was mentioning, train on how to install R and R-Shiny and how to set up a new service on the DHIS2 or on the server somewhere, or to have to send that data offsite somewhere if you already have an instance in your local country or in a data center somewhere. Similarly, another advantage of this is security. So something that we haven't talked about as much, but in a lot of the vulnerability management situations that we've addressed in the last year, with the security team that has come on board at DHIS2, is deploying not only a custom backend or not a custom backend, but a new release of DHIS2 which addresses that security issue, but also applying or providing guidance for how to mitigate that vulnerability. You can't upgrade your server right away, because upgrading a server can be quite a difficult task and a risky task, right? If you have to swap out your production operational DHIS2 instance, that's quite an expensive operation. It takes some time. You want to do a lot of testing to be able to make sure that that's the case. But if that takes a week or if that takes a month and there's a known vulnerability in your server, you're opening yourself up to the potential of a hack or an attack from someone that knows about that, which once the software has been released, everyone knows about it. So it's kind of a catch-22 there. So what we've been doing is, in this environment, providing guidance for how you could mitigate that attack through a customization of Nginx or Apache or whatever gateway service you happen to be running. But that's a lot of work as well for the implementation. So if you're very responsive, but you're also very thorough, you're going to do a lot of testing before you upgrade your server, and that might take some time. But we see that a lot of countries and a lot of implementers of DHIS2 aren't paying attention necessarily to the need for upgrading this as quickly as possible. So they might be on a version that's much, much older, or that would take a lot of more work to actually get upgraded. So they would need to then also, if we provide a mitigation so that they don't have to do that, they also need to go in and figure out how to actually modify their system to provide this, to apply this mitigation at the gateway level. So rather than doing that, we can, in this situation, we can have a managed service that is very lightweight and thin in front of DHIS2 that basically provides that mitigation and that rate limiting and a lot of other services to secure DHIS2 outside of the core itself. So that can be upgraded independently. It can be rolled back if there is any issue very easily. It doesn't have any implications on the database itself or the applications speaking to the database. So it has a lot of advantages there as well. This approach is similar to something called a web application firewall, and basically being able to apply rules to something that blocks some traffic coming into DHIS2. This also allows for managed scripts and integrations as well that are kind of built into DHIS2 rather than needing to be built externally to that, which provides a common way for implementations of DHIS2 to talk about their infrastructure and to containerize and kind of standardize the way that those services are rolled out. So now let's go back to the App Hub, which we can talk about how that can expand to more than just applications. So a very common use case we see today is metadata packages. We've heard a lot about several of them have been, that have been built by many of you, as well as by the University of Oslo team in collaboration with WHO. But they're files that live somewhere. And so the idea to make that similar to the App Hub, something that you can install into your server from somewhere and see what new versions are available, see what the difference is between the version that you have currently installed and the version that has been published, makes a lot of sense. We think of that as a metadata package hub or an extension of the App Hub to be able to also support metadata configuration. Android application, being able to deploy those through a similar mechanism to the App Hub rather than through the Play Store, for example, which has its own challenges in terms of publication, especially for third-party or custom applications, can be an advantage as well. And other ways to customize the extensions or the customizations with the installation of localization or translation and documentation for specific applications. So rather than needing to update the entire application, you can just install the Russian or the Swahili or the French localization version of that application, even if it's not something that you developed yourself. Similarly with documentation, if you want to translate your documentation or even just write new documentation for your application and bundle it inside of DHIS2, so it's available offline, it's available in situ where the user is, to be able to have that documentation also reflect the workflows that you're trying to promote for the users of DHIS2 in your system. And then similarly, we talked about being able to very easily install new applications and then also roll them back. But similarly, it might make sense and be something that would be good to support to have beta deployments or parallel deployments of applications. So you install a new version and you make that only available to a certain subset of your users. You allow them to test it out, to validate it. And then at some point you promote that to the standard version that's available to all your users. So you can actually have two versions of the same application installed at once and available to different sets of people. And finally, getting to feedback loops. So this, I think, is something that is very useful not only for application developers, again, but also for implementers and also for users. Is right now it's a bit of a black box a lot of the time. Even with the built-in applications, what are your users actually using on a day-to-day basis? How are they using it? Are they actually accessing the dashboard that you spent a lot of time working on building and fine-tuning, or is it too complex and they avoid it? Or are they actually using this third-party application? So even within a DHIS2, a single DHIS2 instance, that can be very interesting information to expose. And we have some of that in the usage analytics app, but there's a lot more that we could do there. But similarly, it's useful for the developer of an application to be able to understand in the 10 different DHIS2 instances or 100 different DHIS2 instances or 1,000 different DHIS2 instances, how many people have upgraded to this latest version of the application? How many have actually installed it and are still using it versus just installed it and then uninstalled it and never used it again? And similarly, if those implementations are running into issues, right now it's a very manual reach out by email to someone somewhere process to be able to report an issue or to request a feature for that application that you've installed from the App Hub, whether that comes from UIO or from some third-party developer. So being able to facilitate those feedback loops to allow the implementations to understand how their users are using their instances or their applications and their tools, collect that in the implementation itself, and then optionally, so this is opt-in and privacy preserving, so it's not something that would happen automatically, but be able to basically forward that information on to the developers of the application or to UIO or to whoever was providing that application at the get-go. This is useful for extension developers as well as for extension users, as I mentioned. So being able to understand how do I know who is using my application? How do I communicate with them? How do I tell them that new versions are available? How do I know if they're actually using the things that I'm building? What errors are people experiencing is very useful information for a developer to understand and to improve and maintain their application over time or their extension over time. And similarly, as I mentioned, for extension users, it can be quite useful to understand who else has already installed this application, who is using it, and or how many people are using it, do people like it, things like that. And what is also the sustainability plan for this application? So that's something that is quite a challenge sometimes. Is there can be some open source code that sits on in a GitHub repository somewhere, but nobody ever would maintain it. And if you're going to install it, especially in a national HMIS system, you want to understand who built that. Is there a plan to maintain it over time? If I'm a national ministry or a funder, can I contribute to make sure that that is maintained over time? Who do I talk to if I want to see about doing that? So these are all things that maybe are a little bit softer than the technical flowing of information, but that we want to facilitate through the App Hub and through the application infrastructure. And with that, I'll talk finally about a global community, and that's all of us here and the people that are watching online and the hundreds of people that joined the annual conference in June in Oslo, and the many thousands of people that use DHIS2 on a daily basis around the world, and how we can all work together for this. So number one is, don't reinvent the wheel. So we have a lot of very innovative use cases for DHIS2 and extensions for DHIS2 and DHIS2 applications themselves within the core. And it's important to think about what other people have already done and use those if they exist, or collaborate on them if you can, rather than reinventing the wheel every single time. And that's similar to the approach that we took with the application platform to stop reinventing the wheel within our own applications. Among the 30 different applications that all need to basically implement the same things over and over and over again, there are ways you can kind of share some pieces of that, but it's still a lot of work to make sure that the experience is consistent and that you're not reinventing the wheel. And that's the same thing that can happen with, or that we hope to foster within the community, to be able to support each other in that. Using those shares extensions is a great starting point, and give feedback to the developers of those extensions of the DHIS2 applications themselves within the UIO team, et cetera. And then there's sharing your feedback and input with us, with the University of Oslo and the core software team. we would love to hear from all of you. I've heard a lot of very interesting experiences and sharing of innovative uses of DHIS2, extensions of DHIS2, using it as an ELMIS system, using it as all sorts of different things, and extending it beyond what it can do out of the box. So number one, don't suffer in silence if there are challenges, because we can help. And number two, share with us the successes as well, because we would love to hear from you about those. On the development side, we have, as I mentioned, a developer advocacy team and the core team itself to be able to support the developers that are all working on DHIS2 applications and solving similar problems, often in silos. So being able to kind of facilitate that community using that developers.dhis2.org community building site is very useful. And sharing also just what you're building is useful for us and useful for the entire community. You may have noticed that the concept of a core application is becoming less of a core application in this. So we're separating out the releases of the server from the releases of the applications, which also means that the goal is anything that the University of Oslo can build as an application, someone else could build too, right? So you could build an application that does everything that the data visualizer application does or the dashboard application does, but does it in a slightly different way that targets a very specific use case. Don't reinvent the wheel, but the idea is that it's not something that's just the University of Oslo can do that. So this makes core contributions easier to contribute because it's just an application. It's just the same thing that you're building for your own use cases and hopefully sharing with other people already. Just taking that to the next level of making sure that it's generic and that it's useful to a very wide range of users. We still have a little ways to go with this, so there still are some things that have are necessarily tied in with the data model that might need to change over time. So there's still a need to kind of contribute back to the core development, the server development as well, to make sure that the requirements for those extensions or for those applications are being met and as they change over time. And as we move to full stack extensions beyond just web applications, this becomes even more powerful. And the range of potential extensions that you can build, whether that's a kind of single click install to integrate with an external system, or very easy to install our Shiny application that does sophisticated analysis of malaria trends over time and reporting rates. All of that should become easier and easier to build and then to share with the community. And I believe this is final. Yeah, finally, share your input with us. So this is an ask to all of you to get in touch with the core team, because we want to hear from you. We want to work with you to make DHIS2 better and to continue to improve it, to hear the user stories. We've heard many of them today. I would love to get everybody that spoke at this conference to come and talk to the entire core team of developers at DHIS2, just to say, this is what we're doing with the things that you build. These are the challenges, but these are the things that this is helping us to do. So that is very useful for the entire community to really see what those challenges are, to address them in a generic way, and to get excited, as we all do, about the ways that this can be used for very good things. Similarly, share the insights and learnings that you have, and join the community of practice and the discussions there to really share your experiences and learn what other people are experiencing, and get in touch with not only the University of Oslo team, but the entire community of everyone here and the many, many thousands of people that are using DHIS2 in their daily work and their daily life. And I think that's it for me. Thank you.